Oh, there we go. All right.
So we are here now live in a new episode of Late Night Anarchy, and we are here with a very interesting guest, Morgan, which is a freelance writer, has been writing a lot of different stuff in different outlets about culture mostly. And he has been, I think he has been of very interesting tweets about what are the cultural shifts in the latest time. So we could start by talking about your piece in first things. I think it was
Yeah, it was first things.
about I think you should close I think it's there is a little bit of loop between the link that I sent you about the live stream, because it's now it sounds better.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, so the issue is that uh, I think it was very interesting because as someone who lives in Lima in Latin America, I mean, some American series have had relatively success, but things that are on the internet, it's relatively strange that they have any kind of success, and it's very strange because the other way I was with a relative, and she was saying about like we were in a taxi, and there in the radio they were talking about Stranger Things, and the guy was spent more than an hour saying about how great it was Stranger Things, and how it was the best show ever. And I hadn't seen Stranger Things, but it was very surprised to me that the show about the 80s in a very particular way in America have affected that much of some people here. And it's very curious because the situations in the 80s in America and here in Peru are completely different situations. Here
Yeah.
was the shining path,
Yeah, yeah.
so it was a really strange kind of thing. I don't know how it came to connect in some way. It was very strange.
Who was your president then? Was it Fujimura was his name?
No, it was then Alan Garcia, and before below he was more of a centrist, and the other technically was center left. So then he goes center right, and he was a very heterodox kind of character. But I think it was, I don't know what to make about Stranger Things, but I feel that when all people seem to love one thing, is I have to be hesitant to jump in that.
Um, I don't blame you actually because that was something I wrote last year about season one, and I tried to watch season one on my own and didn't really get that far. I never really liked a lot of what the show was about or what it was inspired by, like E.T. and things like that, and the nostalgia. Um, and it wasn't until my friend Julia, the editor, contacted me and said, "Do you want to write about Stranger Things?" I was like, "Sure." And so I binge watched it in like under a week and gave it, I guess, a decent enough write up. Um, but it wasn't a good review. I didn't really like the first season. I wasn't surprised by it. Like my expectations weren't really like they didn't go up or down. They just kind of that's it offered something in total. I mean, I didn't really feel like taking it, um, and because it was kind of just mired in things that people born in a certain time would be more into. Like I think I said between um, 1967 and like 1975. I was born in 1984. So I know I have memories of watching ET and things like that. but I really wasn't of that moment, and so a lot of the a lot of the specifics of it didn't really resonate with me. And so I think they put all that stuff sort of before atmospherics and narrative and uh, you know being a sort of genre show. And I don't know, it wasn't a gangbusters piece, but my family read it, and it was very controversial for them because they all love the show. But I know I have a lot of friends who are Gen X who liked it too, and sort of said it's just one man's opinion. And I changed it when I watched season two because I think they improved on certain things. Like I was a bit more invested in the world they created and the people in it, and not just the time in which they exist. And it kind of, I just made a joke because it takes place in October of 1984, so I would have been like 4 months old. So, so I'm in the timeline, so I can look at it more objectively.
Yeah, I mean, for example, there has been like a little bit, at least here in Peru, a little bit about nostalgia about not only the kind of mainstream films that were, but the underground scene, because the 80s there was basically the anarchist movement disappeared in Peru in the early part of the century because more or less every anarchist became a Marxist in any way, in some form, and but in the 80s like there was kind of people interested in punk, and that people interested in punk become interested in anarchism, and so it was different than the anarchism of the early century. And there are a lot of people sort of especially interested in punk that said, oh, that era was great, but when they interviewed people that lived that era, said that it was really awful time to live. There were bombs. There were a lot of things happening, and anarchists. And while there have been like some radical left wing movements that it is very strange relationship between the revolutionary movement. Tupac Amaru has a very different relationship with the left than the Shining Path, but especially the Shining Path. Obviously, the people knew that Shining Path was totally anti-anarchist, and they view anarchism as bourgeois, and
Well,
in many
the
ways,
Shining Path was Maoist, right?
yes.
Okay.
So they, yeah, it was a very strange kind of that kind of nostalgia. But it was surprised because I was thinking that the nostalgia that was about this era was going to be like a nostalgia more for the 90s than for the 80s, because I was thinking that the 80s was more like the first part of 2000s was a kind of 80s nostalgia, and it's 20 years past, and I think 80s is where we will move on the 80s,
Well,
and
at least like I'm only speaking for America. It's usually like a 30-year period. Um, so like in the 80s, like if you watched, I can't remember which one. I think Back to the Future Part Two. Oh no, Back to the Future Part One. Um, there was in the 80s a big 50s renaissance, and so there were a lot of 1950s themed films. Um, I mean, it's kind of a loose theory with little evidence, and my memory isn't really helping me at the moment. Um, but Back to the Future kind of resonates in that sense, and I think in the aughts there was a bit of a 70s fascination. Um, but I guess the 80s are kind of special for the United States, um, just because it was just in a lot of people's minds it was a better time, even though the 90s is probably more fitting because it was after the Cold War. But I have different. I'm changing my views of the 90s. um, because of what's happened after that. It doesn't look as great now. It just looks like a weird blip on the radar in between, Cold War paranoia and post-liberal late capitalism reality that we have now. Um, so I know a 90s revival is actually kind of happening. Like if you've seen shows, uh, 13 Reasons Why, um, which was controversial because it's a really bad show about teen suicide. But one of the things I noticed was the show has a very retro soundtrack, um, like with Joy Division, Bob Mould, um, some other come to mind, but also was very obsessed with grunge fashion and cassette tapes. So it was very much retro in a lot of its choices. Um, so Stranger Things isn't really the only culprit here in this whole sort of rewind to better times thing.
Yeah, but I wonder how like it's going to be represented in the 80s, the more countercultural aspects of the 80s, because when Richard Linklater, the filmmaker, was talking in an interview about his film that he pointed out that his latest film before the no that he's trying to promote is about college life in Austin, I think, or in Texas in the 80s, and he was
Oh, everybody
saying
wants
that,
some.
yeah, exactly that, and he was saying that he wanted to make a film about what happened next, like after he left, because it's kind of autobiographical. He left college, and he got in contact with the underground scene in Texas with the people in the punk movement, and there's a hint about that. I don't know if you remember. There is a scene there where there is a guy with an anarchist T-shirt in a punk concert. So there is, he was trying to portray
I
this.
never, I never actually seen the film. The last Linklater film I remember seeing um, is Dazed and Confused, which is weird for me to see because the characters in that film are my mom's age. Um, so it gives a nice window, and my mom's from Florida, so she's from nearby, so it gives me you know a nice interesting window into kids of that generation. Um, and also Suburbia was another one I saw, which was the adaptation of the Eric Bogosian play.
Yeah, I
Um,
watched it on, but I didn't was very convinced by the film. Even that Linklater is my favorite filmmaker, and that I think this Slater is my favorite film. But Suburbia was kind of not my cup of tea. I really don't. I don't know. I mean, I feel that the movie wasn't like what I was expecting from Linklater. I feel that sometimes adapting something is because he is someone that is good at writing some stuff, so adapting other people's is not necessarily the expertise.
well, it's tough because um, when you're doing films like that, um, you always, not always, but you tend to look back and romanticize it. And you're kind of putting a sheen over a time that was really not that different from ours now. Um, because it's just run by the same people. They just have more stuff. Um, and but as to counterculture and punk in the 80s, that obviously was a bit more different. Um, just because there was less communication available. Um, so it's kind of it's difficult for people today to imagine a culture where you don't have to just email someone at a club and ask if they can book you. You have to make all these long distance phone calls, and you're sort of stuck in a city, and you have only local resources. Um, so that's kind of the more interesting aspects of it. And stuff like Stranger Things and Everybody Wants Some, uh, and any other kind of sort of film that looks back has to look from a very a general view, and it always falls on a suburban view. Um, so it's always interesting when um, suburban culture sort of resonates outside the United States. Um,
Well, here, I mean, basically, well, I have been in Argentina and Mexico and Republic of America, but Dominican Republic. But what I have noticed is that there is no concept like suburbia, at least in the sense of United States. I think there are some areas that could be residential in many ways, but not necessarily in the style of suburbia. For example, Puerto Madero in Argentina is a very residential area, but it's because that's literally a port, not because it's suburban and there are like high skyscrapers and it's not the same. And so yeah, it's very curious. I think that there are many issues with how American culture, and sometimes it's more strange because, for example, a series well, not a series, a movie that had quite success in the black market here in Peru because it never opened commercially in theaters was Scott Pilgrim versus the War. I saw a lot of people with a bootleg copy of that film, and it was kind of strange because it was not about America per se. It was about although it was a co-production with the United States, it was shot in Canada. It was had a lot of Canadian actors, and it was really a very curious and unique film. And
it was
it
about
had, huh?
it was about nerds.
Yes.
Again, that's a film I haven't seen. I just know its reputation, and kind of understand where it derives from. Um, and films like that take place after the internet became a thing, um, I think have better reach. And so, nerd culture is, knows no boundaries. If you have internet access and you have peculiar interests, you'll find, you know, you'll get the signals. And I guess the film borrows from video games, right? Not, it's a comic book, but it uses kind of video game framing, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken.
Yes, that's true.
Well,
Yeah, it's video games plus music and a love story. I will say that's cool somewhat. Yeah, I mean it's very strange how like uh, um, independent American culture basically has come in Latin American form of bootleg because independent cinema a lot of times didn't like cinemas are very how to put it in this way are very kind of they don't try to risk much in showing films that they think they won't work. And when they try to like be bold and try to try something new, they prefer sometimes a European film, especially if they seek advice from film critics. And film critics in Latin America have tended to, at least, well, the previous generation, I think that there are now a new generation of film critics that, to be honest, I don't know that much their views. but the kind of previous generation were more drawn into the European film. Yeah. So it's bootleg has been the way that many people, for example, the indies of the 90s, that was the way that a lot of people, especially in Peru, because in Peru the economic crisis of the 80s make more or less all the films were shut down, and so the few films that were open, like open only the largest blockbusters, and were replaced by Cineplex kind of chain cinema. So the only way that people had to see films after Blockbuster was closed also was bootleg. And have seen that in other places in Latin America, I have seen that has been more or less the only way that people have seen. And it's a very different way, because sometimes a lot of people have the association of the idea of film with the movie theater, and that is kind of something that especially with indie films, that still doesn't happen, with exception of Argentina, that now has a larger film market. They have a large film festival, the Fisi and the Mar del Plata Film Festival. They have a little bit of smaller film festivals, and to a certain degree, um, Brazil that has opened some indie films had opened there. I think, for example, there's a Quebec film, Hair Beats, which was from this director Xavier Dolan, opened there like commercially. It was kind of crazy when I hear that. But yeah, it's American independent culture. It is particularly has been like reaching Latin America, but in a very super way. You know, not still as for example, everybody wants them. I was thinking that it will open commercially, but it didn't.
Well, it's funny when
Well,
you
it's
mention
funny when you mention
um,
um,
movie theaters,
movie theaters,
which is funny
which is
because
funny because
the movie theaters in my area, and one that I used to work at um, back when I was in college, are closing. So cinema, as in going to a cinema, is becoming less common. I think there's like one independent movie theater in my area. It has only one theater, so it only has one movie, and it's usually like the top tier. Like the last one I saw there was a Wes Anderson film. I can't remember what it's called. Um, but most of the stuff I get most of my stuff through streaming services. Um, and so the films that I mean, I don't, I live near New York, so I don't go in there that much. So New York, it's a bit different. Um, so I went in New York to see Ingrid Goes West, but otherwise I would have to wait a little while.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah, that's, for example, a film that I don't think will be open commercially here. Um, yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that, for example, when I went to see Blade Runner, the last Blade Runner this year, I mean, it wasn't the week that it opened. I wanted to go, but I was kind of busy that week, so I went the next, and it was uh, a Sunday, 5 p.m. I think, and it was completely full, and it was kind of crazy because Sunday is not the most the day where most people go to movies. For some reason, it's Saturday, and Sunday is usually it starts to decline. Saturday, I mean, it's Saturday, Friday, and Saturday, kind of at least here in Peru, that people tend to go, and Sunday, like, but I went, and it was kind of strange, but it's still the people on the cinemas don't trust much or kind of issues. So yeah, and what do you feel that kind of films like Ingrid Goes West cool, in their distribution, or going to try to still focus on on demand or a streaming service,
Well,
or the
well, here's an interesting example. Last month, whatever studio was bankrolling it finally released like the upteenth Amityville horror film. Um, so a murder happened in Long Island. You know, some kid killed his whole family, and then a family moves in and claims supernatural activity, and it becomes this whole phenomenon. There's a movie with James Brolin and Margot Kidder, and then from there are like sequels and remakes and all this stuff because the house is still standing. Um, and so this most recent one, I think I'd heard about like 2 years ago, and nothing came of it. And then they just released it on, I think, Google for free, and they released it in theaters, and it made $700 total. Um, which is, I think, more says about the film than the industry itself, because it was such, I don't know why it had to be made. Um, the Amityville horror stuff is kind of a subculture unto itself. Um, but you know, I can't speak to your experience in Blade Runner because everyone I know who saw Blade Runner saw it in near empty theaters, and they did not like it because it was like over 2 hours long, and apparently nothing happened.
yeah, it is. I have heard the complaints, but yeah, I have heard that it didn't make it like that good numbers. What I have read is that, for example, like Mexico is a very strong market for some films. Um, for example, I think that, like there was an independent film that made $500,000 there. So it's not a lot, $500,000 in movie history, but for an independent film, it's kind of a lot. And Mexico City is the largest city in the world, so yeah, I think that some American distribution companies are more interested in particular kind of places, and Mexico City there are a lot of cinemas, so yeah, it makes sense. But still, in Lima is much more complex because there are not as many cinemas as in Mexico. But yeah, so to move to our topic, this year is basically the Punk's 40th birthday, and it's kind of very curious the reactions that it's having, because I was reading um, an article about how like punk is becoming like the even the British embassy is financing some events about punk, and try to portray as part of British influence, and how even China is funding some punk bands. It's very crazy things, like one listens about punk, and it's very strange because there was a piece in Noisy was very interesting about how like a lot of people have think about punk as this left wing kind of ideology, but he was like trying to portray it as a punk has a long history with neo Nazis, and with what is called the alt right. So it's kind of these dichotomies in this punk movement, and it's very and the Libertarian Anarchist was saying online, he was saying for a while that punk wasn't actually about uh, like white working class culture. It was kind of more reactionary, and he points out that a lot of punks had very sexist kind of lyrics, and yeah, so it's a complex issue how to to read punk in many ways?
Well, punk is such a broad topic, and it comes in, it sort of brings a lot of things together. Um, and it's kind of sustained, unlike, previous countercultures, it's sustained itself because it's so malleable. But um, like a while back, I was reading an essay that Lester Bangs had written in the Village Voice about what you brought up was the pervasive racism in the New York scene at the time. And it's actually a pretty good piece. I don't always go for Banks's stuff, but it's a good sort of observational reported piece. And he notes all the different ways in which racial conflict and racial attitudes have sort of seeped into the scene, whether sort of, underhandedly without anyone really noticing, or through irony, which is a continuing problem. So there have always been conflicts like that, especially, and in a city like New York, it's, I guess, with all different people just sort of working together in this scene. And he interviewed like black members of television and got their views on it. But there's always been a lot of divides in the punk scene. Like, there's this, I think because of Nirvana, people are more familiar with the sort of Fugazi side of things, which is the more, not intellectual, but liberal, more politically engaged, more moralistic. And then there's always been, the more working class side of it, which is a bit tougher, more masculine friendly, like Agnostic Front, which had a lot of right-wing lyrics, and sort of other sort of tough guy bands like that, like 25 to Life. I don't know if they're really political, but they're kind of associated with that, where they all kind of sound the same. And straight edge, I'm thinking mostly of New York here. So straight edge scenes like Youth Today, Judge especially, although Judge were kind of trolls because they were purposely provocative. Or Earth Crisis in Syracuse, who are kind of very particular in their politics, either very conservative or very militant, but always very simplistic. They have one message and then they're here to give that message. So it's all a matter of style, really. Style and sort of, I don't know, where you kind of gravitate to. I always sort of was more into the Fugazi side of things because it was a bit more literary, I guess, and kind of was a little bit more varied and diverse as far as sound and influence.
I
I don't know
mean,
if that.
like, yeah, I mean, here, I mean, punk was more marginal. I mean,
Well, you had one of the original punk bands, right? Los Psychos?
yeah, yes, but despite that, has been kind of marginal. I mean, all in the media, I mean, on the newspapers, it's very strange that people mention much about punk and well, punk was rock culture has there are many cultural historians that have some struggles of saying it has been like I don't say working when the term working class in Peru, in particular in Latin America, who have various meanings, because there is kind of like lower middle class, and there's people, immigrants which, of indigenous communities, are not necessarily the ones that move to the punk scene, for example. Like there were other kinds of rock movements, but it has been like there have, even if now it's a very weak period for punk here. I remember that back in the 90s, there were kind of popular the pop punk bands. It was very crazy, like Blink 82, the
Mm.
Austrians were kind of popular here, and it was kind of strange. And Green Day is very popular, although. Uh, I mean, it's not the kind of hardcore punk that people sometimes associate to the war punk, yeah, Green Day has come many times, and they have like playing in stadiums, like sold out stadiums. So it's kind of like, so that's kind of the duality. Like there are some foreign bands that had success here, and on the other hand, the punk scene has almost diluted in history. And it's very curious. But I was thinking about how punk works and plays in many curious ways. For example, my favorite moment in the history of television was when in the Tonight Show, how Jay Leno, when Jay Leno was still there. So he was interviewing Ron Paul, and he were talking about cute cutting government programs, even the military. He wanted to cut many things in the government, and they had the band that was going to play was Sex Pistols, and and he was saying like Sex Pistols is going to play, and he looked at Ron Paul's face, and he said something that know
I know what you're talking about.
you
And then,
like.
and then
I mean,
Johnny Rotten said something about Ron Paul, right? Because that's when they started playing again, I think.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. Johnny Rotten is John Lydon, I guess, is such a character on his own now. Like he's, it's hard for me to, like in this book that I reference a lot, Our Band Could Be Your Life. John Lydon comes on in under criticism in multiple chapters because all these bands have opened for Public Image Limited, and then when they meet him, they're always disappointed because he's such, a celebrity prick. Um, and the Sex Pistols were kind of baseline interest. Like when I grew up, you got into the Sex Pistols and you very quickly got out of them. You moved on to something else. And that's actually how it happened in the British scene at the time. Once they imploded, people started to notice uh, that the Sex Pistols were kind of a concoction of Malcolm McLaren, a successful one. I think McLaren would have no issue with the Sex Pistols being honored by the British Embassy, or punk being the theme of a Met Gala, as it was a couple of years ago. Um, and, because that was sort of his aim. Um, but, people in the audience, people like in Killing Joke and Joy Division, and in other bands, were like, okay, this is cool. I can do this, and I can do it in my own way. So it's that principle that the Sex Pistols inadvertently set off, where they're kind of a beta test of more interesting things. Um, like, James Parker at The Atlantic compared Donald Trump to the Sex Pistols. And that was kind of controversial. And I didn't like it myself because I thought it was a bit too much of a gimmick. Um, was that, but thinking about it, it kind of made sense because of the way the Trump campaign came about, thanks to Roger Stone, who is a McLaren figure. He's very savvy, knows what the audience wanted, and Trump was not iconoclastic, but he was very vulgar.
Yeah.
And like the Sex Pistols, they really, he really didn't. I'm not sure if he's a true believer in any of it. So in that sense, it was correct, and the presidency is as shambolic as the band was. Um, but again, my point is usually whatever comes after is more interesting. So the post-Trump politicians might have something to sort of build onto that, which is something that political observers should probably be prepared for. But then I don't know, I'm not a seer. It's just something that I used Killing Joke as an example, of how one direction it could go.
But what do you think about this guy of the, I don't know how was Joseph, the Infowars guy that said
Paul
conservatism.
Joseph Watson. Um, well, conservatism is new counterculture is not his invention. That's an opinion that's been around probably since I remember it being mentioned by Jim Goad in Answer Me magazine, who is a big influence on the alt-right. But I think it goes back to National Review. When William F. Buckley in the editorial for the first issue says, conservatives are the ones standing athwart history, yelling stop. So that's always been in the conservative mindset. Like, I think it's rooted in Buckley's mentor, Wilmore Kendall, who always described capital L liberals as being this pervasive force in American culture. And being the big enablers of world communism. I think he was the only one who made the most, he tried, I don't know if he succeeded, he tried to make a very intellectually robust defense of McCarthyism. But whether or not that's true, I have no idea, because progressivism would have to progressivism and liberalism would kind of have to be and they're kind of disparate, like they're very atomized. I don't see them as like these insurmountable forces. I think there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to those views in media that make them seem bigger, but I'm not sure that they are. And usually I see sort of publicity attempts, of rebranding conservatism as edgier, as kind of a way to counter that, but not really to catch the popular feelings of people. Trump's campaign essentially just, it sort of hinged on, I'm going to represent you who have not been represented well for X amount of years. And you represent something more authentic than what Obama and his supporters have been representing. That was Trump's message. It wasn't countercultural. It was purely sort of reactionary.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different things going on.
But
and I don't
for
know
example,
if, sorry.
yeah, for example, like the I think there was a piece in Jacobin about paleoconservative for porn that was about and
Oh,
it was,
yeah, I know what you're talking about, and by Angela Nagel,
yeah, I think
I think
that,
it was.
but I think she, like a lot of the left in some way has been very confused about the alt-right. I think that they have like in some way like try to conflate paleoconservatism, even some I think that even some forms of neo-reaction are opposed the alt-right, because some I have read some there was I don't, someone wrote an erectionary case against Trump, and it was a really very thoughtful piece against Trump, and it was, it's funny because I haven't found it since. I wanted to put a link to that because it was very strange, but that it was kind of, so there have been many movements in the right, inside the right, that are not neocons or or the main strain of Christian conservatism, particularly the evangelical conservatives. And in that kind of movements, there are some that have come from a very different perspective. And there was an article some time ago about how geeks won the cultural war, but I feel that the problem with that article was, despite it makes some good and curious points about it, it was that sometimes people think in geeks as some sort of progressive thing in a very curious way, but people tend to forget Gamergate, for example, and that people link with Gamergate then go to the alt-right, or people were influenced by that kind of events. And I know that sometimes talking about Gamergate is kind of strange, because some people think that it was worse than the Holocaust. When I started to hear about the Gamergate, it was kind of like, it was like people were talking about a mass murder, something like that, and it was very strange. But anyway, the idea was that this kind of Greek culture is very complex to understand it political, like conservatism, because it's very it has many different people that come from very different stuff. For example, like people, Mark Zuckerberg, some people said that he's going to run, and a lot of stuff, but his company had a very kind of sexist kind of origin, especially in times that the left is trying to call everything sexist, but it was rape women's face and bodies, and that was the Facebook. Facebook comes from that. So it, and that is the relationship with pornography. There is a kind of the more dark sides of G culture. So this kind of words that come from porn, like conservative, like it was kind of the alt right, where we're saying that word every day, and for a while it made kind of popular, and yeah, to the point that this guy Asawin Swepsang, which is a Thailandese guy from Thailand who works at the Daily Beast, once was interviewed by the Japanese television about that term. It was a, yeah, it was very weird. I think how these things have been deployed in the last times.
Well, when thinking about stuff like this, because it's so hard to really summarize the alt-right, probably one of the more salient lessons from the last couple of years was watching sort of politics uh, sort of acquaint itself with the internet. Um, and so we're still learning stuff about the internet and how it works. And it's I think about it like, the printing press from several centuries ago, and how that just sort of opened the floodgates for, you know, more than just learned people to participate in, discourse. Um, but that's watching the internet go from this really this idealistic thing of everybody having their voice, and then people using that for almost exclusively for malice, was kind of a big eye opener, I guess. And things like memes and all of this, sort of changing how people debate, how people spread ideas. I mean, it's not really spreading ideas; it's just sort of spreading inside jokes that are disguised as ideas. So we have a lot of new communication formats, and people who are, who grew up on the internet know it better than, say the people who created Verit, which was a justly mocked item for, I don't know, a couple of days, I guess. So it's really just like battling one echo chamber against another echo chamber. And so in a situation like that, a bunch of video game people and, and various sort of dilettante types can sort of go and find these ideas that nobody in the Republican Party talks about, paleo conservatism, Pat Buchanan, Samuel Francis, all this stuff, say, oh, this is fresh and new and whatever. And, then Roger Stone gets involved, and then Milo Yiannopoulos gets involved, and Mike Cernovich, and all these people just kind of converge on this big moment, create this whole thing. So stuff like the alt-right, and it's just a huge mess that just happened to find this avatar who was in the White House. It's very hard to explain, and it's not something that's going to be very coherent until like maybe 20 years down the line.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be very complex, because I was reading an article about was written early this year about how the Sundance directors handled the Trump election, and a lot of the Sundance directors were of the ones that had participated in the international competition. They were making foreign films in other countries, and even they had to say something about the Trump election. And I feel that there is a danger that everything is going to be about Trump, and it's going to be very crazy if films start to talk about Trump. But on another side, I was just watching there's an article about the anarchist topics in Korean history, probably the most known of the last films, the Korean films that has to do with anarchism is Okja, where they portray the Animal Liberation Front. And this kind of stuff, I feel that could come up in these years. Like, there is a lot of interest in Antifa, and it's kind of weird, I was watching a French television report on the Antifa, and it was very crazy, and it was very weird. I know some. There are few libertarian anarchists who have certain relationship with Antifa, not as strong as the leaders of the movement. And so it's a kind of controversial term for anarchist group. But as far as I know, there are very complex internal debates there, because some people think that there are people that just hate Trump and go there, but they don't know much about anarchism, and even praise people like Mao, for example, and it's very crazy. And I don't know if films are going to start portraying anarchism, that I don't know what they're going to portray, because I hope they don't going to end up portraying a Mao fan as an anarchist. but anything could happen.
Well, I'm trying to think of how stuff like this has been covered in the past, like the film Baader Meinhof, um, about the German New Left and New Left terrorism. There's also the documentary about Weather Underground that came out maybe 10, 15 years ago. Um, and I don't know how that necessarily relates to Antifa or the other stuff that's happening. And I don't really know enough about Antifa's history of where it came about and how it relates to movements like Black Bloc and all that, and the Occupy movement, if there's any correlation at all. I'm just sort of thinking of protest movements that have happened on the left over the last like 5 years. Um, yeah, so I don't know. So I don't know how they'll deal with it. And I know now there are a lot of shows that are trying to push relevance on it. Just whether it seems to have any uh, sort of correlation with the subject matter or not. Like I think American Horror Story is doing something about it. Alias Grace, the Margaret Atwood adaptation, um, has a lot to say about gender relations throughout time. Um, so there are a lot of creators trying to sort of capture the moment, and probably and I don't know if they'll all equally have something interesting to say about it. Sometimes forcing Trump into anything is going to limit its appeal, and it's not going to say anything about America, I think. Um, but nothing comes to mind right now of things that are not just hashtag relevant, but there's something that sort of gets deep into the American psyche, assuming anyone besides Americans finds that at all interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking about, for example, how the Weinstein scandal is going to affect also the industry, well, the movies and series. And I was thinking that series like Californication probably wouldn't have the kind of success that it had. Um, Here in Latin America, the reviews of Californication were quite good, and even that it was a very small channel, the one that aired it. But yeah, I remember the kind of womanizer that is portrayed there. So I don't know if these kind of shows are going to have like these kind of characters that are portrayed in some shows are going to have the same effect now with this kind of context.
I've actually noticed a lot of what's been talked about right now. Because Weinstein's been so influential to numerous careers, um, his removal from his position, um, and how that affects his companies will create a vacuum. Um, and there was a piece that Matt Zoller Seltz, a critic at New York, wrote about Louis C.K., saying that it's fine to sort of stamp Louis C.K.'s and other people's work as for archival interest only, and then move on to something new. And sort of implied what's coming after is going to be very interesting. So there's going to be a huge cultural shift as more people have these allegations and the companies that they're tied with respond to it. I think as of right now, Louis C.K. has lost pretty much everything he's been tied to. So, there's going to be, after that, a whole different breed of producers and things like that. It's just a natural sort of how things work. Like the thing with Kevin Spacey and being replaced by Christopher Plummer, who, what I'm told, was the original actor for the part that he's playing, being replaced last minute for a film that's premiering next month. So that has, depending on who you are, either really promising implications or not so promising ones.
Yeah,
But it's tough to comment on that as it keeps happening.
the scandal has reached Peru, and a lot of people have been talking. Even that a lot of the movies that Weinstein produced, especially the more indie ones, never open here. But anyway, the people is still talking, and well, here has happened some mini kind of Weinstein scandal because there's a theater director that has been accused of harass. So and one woman come forward, and then another actress, another actress, another actress, and then I hope, no, not hope, but I more or less think that probably in the next days are going to be more kind of people speaking out against this guy. So
Yeah,
it has
I
been
mean,
like,
it's AV Club called it a moral reckoning, which is correct. Just because it's sort of overturning a power structure, much less favored by it, are having their voices heard in a more substantial way, rightly, I think. And so that's going to change the way people see the industries that are affected by this. And so it's a fairly monumental moment. That's about all I can really comment on that exactly.
yeah, it's a little it's still like early to know where it's going to lead. And but I was wondering how you see that there was a piece in the American Conservative that I think it was very one of the best pieces that I have read there about Whit Stillman, and in that piece, like most of the decent pieces that have been written about Stillman, they mentioned that despite Stillman's conservative sensibilities, he prefers not to talk much about politics.
Well, that in
And
itself is a conservative position.
yeah, yeah, that's true probably. Um,
Well,
and
because um, Stillman is a very moral filmmaker, um, and he writes comedies of manners that sort of hark back. His most obvious influence is Jane Austen. So it kind of harks back to that sort of storytelling about um, the relations between people and how they sort of conflict and come together in weird ways. Um, and that in itself is a point of view. It's just not a very programmatic point of view, um, and not very ideological. But it appeals to a certain person who sees, um, or who would rather see society a certain way. Um, and a film like Last Days of Disco um, probably has a lot of, and all of his films have a lot to critique about contemporary culture, while also on affluence, on relations between men and women, um, but he's not polemical about it. He's just more observational.
yeah, he's relative. I mean, he's certainly an interesting filmmaker, and I would hope that he will do more films in this next years, because he has been always, his films has a lot of charm in many ways that are very kind of particular. He has a very particular style. Some people have described him as the WhatsApp version of Woody Allen, but he has his own style. I think he's not trying to copy Woody Allen. I think that there have been others that have trying to get it, and whether to a certain extent they have succeeded or not, it is.
Yeah, I don't see much commonality between him and Woody Allen, aside from the fact that they have a lot of literary affectations in their work. Like,
That's true.
he's, because Woody Allen, writes plays and has, they both have ears for dialogue. So they're very writerly, but, it's different senses of humor, different preoccupations. And because Stillman, not always, but usually focuses on younger characters. And Woody Allen just kind of, I can't keep track of Woody Allen. I haven't seen his films in a long time. But because Whit Stillman doesn't make a lot of films, he's a little bit easier to summarize.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I always gravitated more to people like Hal Hartley. I'm trying to think of the other guy. Todd Solondz, who's a New Jersey filmmaker. Some of the more offbeat filmmakers.
Yeah.
Who kind of go a bit beyond, the New York affluence thing, and who sort of depict much messier versions of life.
Yeah, I mean, Solons is an interesting kind of filmmaker. He's unique in many ways, and Welcome to the Dollhouse, it really was it was very strange, because I sometimes like hear as reference to something, and it was last year, I think, that I finally saw it, and yeah, it's a really kind of unique kind of filmmaking, and very, I don't know, it's for example the kind of films that never will gonna open here, because Wes Anderson, by my surprise, some films have opened commercially here, but I don't think that songs are going to be able to open here.
Well, Wes Anderson has a very whimsical quality that I think crosses cultures a lot. Certainly his most recent films have that appeal. But Todd Solondz is a very particular filmmaker. It's not even that he's a New Jersey filmmaker. It's just that he depicts things that discomfort people. Welcome to the Dollhouse is his easiest film to watch. It's still a very difficult film to watch because it's about this middle school girl who is very awkward and gawky, doesn't fit in, he's constantly bullied, and it doesn't get resolved at all. And in fact, he revisits that in definitely another film, and I think his most recent one.
Winner Dog, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I have watched the last one, Winner Dog, yeah.
But it was also in Palindromes as well, where the main character, where Dawn Wiener is no longer alive. So Todd Solondz takes, bleak ideas to their logical extreme, and he's very unrelenting. But as people have noticed, he has a way of going into other experiences and kind of does it in a way that's really empathetic and not voyeuristic, unlike someone like Gaspar Noé. I was going to say Michael Haneke, but it's hard to tell with him. I thought The White Ribbon was very good.
Well, but you were kind of saying that I mean, it's back to the issue with the Stillman, like, I mean, for example, like the issue with I don't know how to say, but I feel that for a long time, conservatism in America, in particular, but in general, have like focused on attacking kind of the left more than defending kind of their ideas. But also, for example, there is a huge empty place in trying to see culture and to try to understand it. And for example, there is a very good film review that I read on the American Conservative about Metalhead. It was an Icelandic film, and I for X reason I hope to I found it, and I really enjoyed that kind of film. And it was very strange when people ask me how I found that film, and I say that I found it in this page, and people ask me why American Conservatives is interested in a film about Icelandic teenage girl which loves metal, and I don't know, but it's kind of very interesting how these kind of relationships could nurture, but also could try to expand both the their public views of many things, and but try to expand like reviews of both literally and movies and music and things like that.
Well, conservative
Well,
isn't,
conservatism,
it's not really a program
it's not
exactly.
really a
And
program
people
exactly. And
who
people
make
who
it out of
make
make a
it,
program out of it, such as what Reagan did and what Irving Kristol did in their particular versions, um, just sort of integrated it into the Republican platform as needed. And so it wasn't really a perfect ideation of conservatism. Um, but I wrote about Twin Peaks for the American Conservative earlier this year, and there's a lot in Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet that can be read as conservative, um, depending on how you read, David Lynch's views of the suburbs, which I think are earnest. Um, but then again, I'm not going to give him that label because David Lynch has a very idiosyncratic life, and he's not a Republican. Um,
Yeah,
it's more just conservatism just kind of happen just kind of comes out of people in unexpected ways,
yeah,
because it's usually stuff that's recognizable, and sort of familiar to them. It's in their backgrounds, um, and for better how it comes out, which is why people like Michael Oakeshott um, are never they're never didactic about their conservatism. They're very lyrical about it, and how Edmund Burke is. And for a lot of people who, it's a point of contention for them because it just says that conservatism either means nothing or everything. Uh, but they say that about liberalism too. Liberalism and conservatism are very similar in that sense. They're moods, they're not programs.
yeah. I well, about that, I think there was an attempt to create a newcom film festival at some point, and actually they tried to invite with Stillman, but he refused to play their films in their festival. I mean, so yeah, I understand what you're saying. So yeah, it's true that like what's conservatism, what's in Latin America, it's a very contentious war because a lot of conserve what colonial history, but what about like indigenous kind of history, and
Yeah,
with Latin America, indigenous population in some countries like Bolivia, Guatemala are overwhelming the large majority.
yeah. I mean, and right now, conservatism just doesn't really mean anything. So, people at CPAC aren't necessarily conservative. That's just a name that they use. And people are sort of reevaluating what that actually means. Because in like raw political terms, uh, you know, as it is in Peru, it has implications as it played out in the South in this summer with Robert E. Lee statues and everything like that. Um, so, you know, no one knows. People either can't explain conservatism or people can explain it for them in terms that they're not comfortable with. Um, and somehow no one is wrong exactly, but that's just the condition of human life. No one's wrong or right. It's just always a sort of mix and match.
I was wondering to go back to the issue about Twin Peaks, the new Twin Peaks. What I haven't watched it yet, but then the thing that I know is that Orwa Simon has played. There's a moment in the show where they watch that clip. So for example, Lynch is a huge fan of Orwa Simon. I think they have played at his foundation and events about David Lynch, and it's kind of curious that kind of, because Orwasimon is a very kind of particular band, and they have a very particular kind of style. As you said, sometimes people cannot interpret the things in some sort of a more conservative way, and in some sense, the style of Simon, they are not dressed like like, I don't know, some kind of almost naked pop singers of dance almost naked, basically.
Well,
So they have another kind of style. They have, like, even if their politics are more left wing, they have another kind of sensibility in many ways that a lot of people in their generation or even younger generations.
I don't know. David Lynch's choices serve his vision, um, which only David Lynch knows the logic of. So it's sort of it's pointless to go much further than that. So he has these aesthetic requirements, and they're not political. They're just what he requires to get his
Yeah.
view out. So there's no one set of tools, visual, sonic, or otherwise, that
Yeah, but
you know.
But what do you think? I think that Orwasimon are a very peculiar band because there are a lot of bands that jump into the wave, and I think that for example, the recent book "Meet Me in the Bathroom," I think it's kind of a story of rock and roll and of rock in general, and in New York City. I think was published by Liz Goodman, something like
I know
that.
what you're talking about.
Yeah, so like a lot of bands like jump in the wave, like in a certain kind of indie vibe.
Well, the secret about the subject of that book is that most of those bands suck, and that was just sort of a really regrettable time uh, in the cultural history of that city. Um, and Interpol, I think, is the only one that comes out fairly well. But I spent a lot of time, not remembering that the Strokes were a big item.
Yeah, I don't feel that the Strokes have like that kind of impact. I mean, they have sound like a little bit. I mean, in Latin America, it's the sound that's. For example, G.I. Jazz has sound a little bit more here, and yeah, Deftones even. So Deftones is another kind of
Well, Deftones I like.
very
They've had a good evolution from 2000 to now. But that's a different thing. It's new metal. And
Yeah.
I don't know. It's my own gripe is seeing, LCD Sound System have a huge breakup concert at Madison Square Garden,
That,
and
sorry,
then get back together 5 years later, which barely counts as a hiatus. But
but I
I
don't
don't
know
know.
if there, but because when she was kind of promoting the book, she was saying that now there is a concept that there is a Williamsburg in every place, and I even feel that that concept is like much honest, because there have been like bohemian parts of town in every town. I mean, um,
Well, Williamsburg is really different from when it was like 10 years ago. Um, at least in way of construction and property. But yeah, I couldn't tell you what new hipster hangouts are now. Um, I just sort of catch things as they come to me. Like I started looking at Pitchfork again to see what's coming out. But I don't know, thinking about Brooklyn as this hub of culture, it was for a time. It's not so much now.
yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because she was making this history about the basically, especially indie rock bands
Yeah.
of the like 10 years, the last 10 years or something like that. And but it was very funny because Pitchfork like decided that the best song of the 2000, between 2000 and 2010 was Grimes' Oblivion, I think, and it was very interesting because it's a it's kind of a very strange kind of thing. I listened to the EP of Grimes, and I kind of like it, but it was kind of something that I didn't think it would turn something so massive, at least
Uh,
in the indie scene.
I don't know if Grimes is massive. I like Grimes a lot, though, and I kind of agree with that assessment. Um, I'm not sure if Grimes does. I think she's tired of playing that song.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Critical consensus is very weird. It's going to be very different 10 years from now, I'm pretty sure. So it's hard to really judge. Um, but
But how do you feel that these new publications are handling out this? I mean, because it's kind of like this book of Les Goodman trying to put an end in a kind of generation, and it's very complex for me because basically music journalism in Peru is almost dead. I mean, the few journals that survive to the to this the last one died in 2007, and it was very funny because they had a lot of interest in Swedish indie pop, and I for strange reasons I became a even as a teenager I had kind of some knowledge of Swedish indie pop because of the reviews, and it was very strange. They even managed to co-edit a CD with Labrador Records, which is a Swedish label. They put this record out and they buy it, and it was really interesting. So I don't know. Sometimes like music magazines try to focus on some things, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes a label could shift and have kind of influence. There was a very small label that at some point had a lot of doing about like indie core. I don't know how to put it, but this kind of indie, much more electronic kind of indie. And there were kind of some bands that make music in an all kind of 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 pe- of, of computers, and yeah, it was so labels and newspapers, music magazines have some kind of influence in influence the music that is going on, but at the same time now that it's much more decentralized in the form of internet, it's difficult to know if they're gonna be the gatekeepers or no, or if they're just going to like,
Um, it's not really about gatekeepers anymore. It's mostly about enthusiasts. Um, like I don't, in my critical writing, I don't think of myself as making um, an authoritative judgment. I'm making a case, um, just how, for or against something, just sort of how I'm responding to it and trying to persuade. It's much easier to persuade someone of your enthusiasms, um, just because you kind of have a better sense of why. And so it's hard for me to sort of just go all in against something, um, to do the hatchet job thing. Um, but I don't know, gatekeeper assumes a kind of ownership over culture, over creative people. Sort of like Paul Morley with Joy Division, Everett True with Nirvana. Um, I was always very ambivalent about that because no one really needed them to be explained to the audience. The audience got it, or they didn't get it. Um, so I couldn't really tell you precisely what the role of the critic is at this point. Um, it's certainly not as a police force. I think no one should think about it in that sense.
yeah.
I think there are people who will make a case for culture going a certain way, um, and how that differs exactly from authority and policing. I don't know, other than it's more individual. You know, like there's no Bible for culture anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
But how you feel that, for example, sites like Pitchfork or IndieWire, which were kind of are still have some influence, but I feel that don't have the same influence that does before. Like now, especially with social media, like before social media was different. Except in the MySpace era, that you try to look up with everything that was going on.
well,
But
yeah, it
then,
is. It is interesting when you have people like um, Anthony Fantano, whoever he is, the needle drop, being the most important uh, music critic, and just a YouTuber. Um, so I don't. It's hard to say really, because people have been telling me that Spin's been going out of business for years, but Spin still exists. It's thriving even. Um, but I don't know what concise purpose they serve other than to just tell people about um, what's out and why it's good or why it's bad. I don't know why people will gravitate to the needle drop or to pitchfork or wherever. Um, it's just kind of audience preference.
yeah, to end this conversation, we could talk about your idea that the kind of the issue with culture is that in the last years, like it's normal for an adult person to like the same things that a high school student more or less.
Mm.
So,
Um,
so
well, I'm going to tweak that a little bit because a friend of mine corrected me saying, that kind of goes back a little bit. It's just something that I noticed. A friend of mine who's an art teacher, who said, if you're talking, he put a sign up in his classroom saying, anyone who's talking about Stranger Things, I'll put you on the upside down. Um, so I think it's, when I was in middle school and high school, teachers, as far as I know, I didn't know what they were watching. I don't think they were watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer as my classmates were. I don't know. But pop culture was still pretty much talked about on one side. So I don't know. I think the conclusion I came to was that, adults and teens can meme together in harmony. It's a nice utopia where everyone just gets the inside jokes. But I do think pop culture is much more pervasive now than it was 15 years ago, just because the internet makes it so. And people can sort of schedule their viewing time a lot better. Whereas, teachers probably wouldn't have had a lot of time to watch more than like one or two shows in a given week, and then you just binge everything. I don't know. I'm sure there are people more sophisticated than I am who can make a better case. That was just an observation that I had that got an enormous amount of likes and retweets for some bizarre reason. I don't know why. I don't know why people respond to anything that I do.
Well,
It's just something. I don't know. It's just something that I thought of that people either agreed or didn't agree with.
well, it was an interesting conversation. I always think your writings are really interesting, and I hope to read more of your stuff soon. So thanks for being here, and people will follow you on Twitter for what's about your new publications.
Thank you for having me.
Well, good night.
Good night.